Today we start the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, as each episode's gonna be a tape and you'll understand in just a second. So we start the show off with seeing that Hannah Baker was a girl that ended up committing suicide at the school, and it looks like our main character Clay can't stop seeing her. As he goes and looks at her locker, this kid named Justin comes up and says that he doesn't need to worry about anything about her and just to move on. And Justin just tells him not to be looking for anything special. Weird. While class is happening, it seems like Clay can't really pay attention as he keeps thinking about Hannah. And of course everyone in the school notices. Hannah's mom and dad end up going up to her locker and getting all of the important stuff that she might have wrote down, or like a diary, and that's where the principal says everything that's in there is what's left. Clay ends up getting confronted by this random woman that he doesn't really know too well, as she says that she's mourning Hannah too and she understands what he's going through. Clay's just like, yeah, okay. His friend Tony ends up asking him if he wants a ride home from school, so he hops in and they get to driving, which is good that Clay has a friend, as Tony ends up putting a cassette tape in and listening to their jam. But while they're driving around town, they end up seeing a theater, and that's where we see it. Clay remembers as he was a trainee for Hannah, and that's basically how he met her. Clay gets home to find a mysterious box sitting on his doorstep, so he ends up going inside to take a look, which is full of 13 cassette tapes. And by 13, obviously there's 7, but there's 2 sides to each one. So Clay starts us off with the first cassette tape, and that's where Hannah talks over and says that if you're listening to this, you're one of the reasons that she died. She says that if you're on the cassette tape, then you need to be listening to this. So the tape tells Clay where he needs to go, as he almost gets caught with his mom. But Clay instantly freaks out from all of this, so he ends up running across town just to get to Tony. Clay ends up helping his dad as he sees that some of those tapes kind of look like the other ones. So he ends up taking them and he just tells him that he needs to go home now. And that's where he listens to the rest of the first tape. It says that the rules are that you have to listen to all tapes and then pass them on to the next person that's about. And if you don't, Hannah's trusted friend will email it out to everyone. It tells Clay the first location as he gets to pedaling. But as he's going that way, he ends up getting followed. He gets chased on the road until he bunny hops off, and the dude disappears. And it talks about this is the start of the end of her life, as this is the first party she had. Seems like Clay actually ended up showing up to it, as Hannah and her friend Kat came down. And we actually figure out that Hannah's a new kid that Bryce tries to hit on. Seems like she kind of flirts back with him, but her friend ends up stopping her, telling her they got better boys. And by better, I mean these two stupid dudes, Zach and Justin. Which Kat explains that Justin, the black shirt, is hers. Zach is all Hannah's. But next day after that party, Hannah ends up looking over to see Justin, and he ends up asking her if she wants to come to his basketball game. She does end up going to it, as her and Clay sit down and watch. And right after, as Clay's about to walk her home, Justin asks if she needs a ride, but she ends up taking the bus. But Justin thinks he's cool as he rides the bus with her. She gives him her phone number and ends up bamboozling him and jumping off the bus, letting him stay on it. It seems like she ends up getting a text from him. They end up going to a little park and hang out, as he ends up taking inappropriate pictures of her going down the slide, as they end up making out. But as Hannah's talking, she ends up saying that everyone else said it was different, as even Clay thought that Justin went down on her. That's why you never listen to rumors. But as Clay's sitting there, Tony ends up showing up. And that's where Tony explains that he's the trusted friend for Hannah. Clay asks how he possibly could be part of her death, and Tony just says he needs to listen to all the tapes. Clay ends up making his way home, as it seems like he's probably ready for the next one. As Clay walks in school after Justin and Hannah hung out yesterday, seems like he's already showing all of his friends, which they end up taking his phone and sending it to everyone. Even Clay got it, and that's where Hannah hopes that Clay won't see her different. But keep in reminder, Clay thinks that they had sex, so he's kind of just mad that she wants to sit with them at lunch. So she tries to just sit down and have a conversation with him. but he ends up just acting really rude with her. So she ends up telling him that he really hurt her feelings, and she feels like she just needs to go. It looks like we're going to be diving straight into the second cassette tape. And we're back with tape 2. We start right back off with Hannah saying welcome back. While the first episode was about Justin, this second tape is about one of her other former friends. And she says, yeah, you want to know how you're involved in all of this, but it'll get to your tape eventually. So after those pictures of Hannah released, everybody still picks on her. Hannah says that some of the people in these tapes didn't hurt her on purpose, but hurt her and didn't even know. And since she thinks that Clay sees her different, she ends up quitting her job and leaving on the spot. And maybe at this one moment, Clay could have saved her life just asking her to stay. But Clay makes it to school and doesn't seem like he can trust anyone. He ends up asking the basketball coach if he's seen Justin, in which he says that he hasn't seen Justin in 2 days. While Hannah talks over and says that this is her old former friend, Jessica. The rip Jessica comes up to Zach asking where Justin is. She said that he's talked to the principal and hasn't talked to any of them. So it looks like these three might be involved. How Hannah and Jessica both met was because they were both the new girls. At first they didn't seem like they'd really like each other, but then they ended up growing onto each other. Which is really good because they ended up finding a nearby coffee shop as they got to get their own coffee every day just to talk. Which is really helping her because apparently she don't have any more friends from that photo that went around. And that's where Clay asks where Justin is, and Jessica says she doesn't know either. She can definitely tell that Clay's got the tapes now. Jessica says she's scared, but she knows she'll find them. One day when they were sitting at the coffee shop, they ended up seeing a little boy stare at them. Hannah thinks he's weird because he sits alone, has no friends, which is honestly the weirdest thing ever. But they end up going over to his table and learn that his name is Alex, and he's a new kid too. He's like he's gonna be joining the team. So two of them ended up turning to 3 as they all always hung out. But while Clay's in the guidance room, he does end up running into him as he doesn't really want to talk. He ends up asking Alex if he's doing alright, and he asks Clay if he's doing alright. It means he could possibly be on the tapes too. They all sit at the coffee shop as they both figure out if their parents are police officers, which is kind of cool, as every day after the coffee shop they all split up and go home. But eventually Hannah ends up saying that Jessica stopped going to the coffee shop and Alex made more friends. But there's one thing that they didn't tell Hannah, and that's where Alex and Jessica actually started a relationship. And as she worked at the theater, her and Clay were just sitting there, and she asks Clay if she's cuter than Jessica. But of course, you know Clay ends up flashing up, but she just thinks that he thinks that Jessica's hotter. So Hannah ends up taking one of the other workers' shifts, but Jessica doesn't know. So Hannah ends up hooking her up with a ticket, as we figure out that her and Alex are going together. So since all this is happening, she makes Alex pay for his ticket. And if you needed to know, Jessica's actually a cheerleader, and most of the others from the tapes are also on the basketball team. And that's where Clay ends up asking if Mr. Porter knows about the tapes, and Jessica says no. And if Clay tells anybody about the tapes, then he will regret it. While Clay's walking home, he ends up getting asked to Zach if he wants to go to Bryce's house. Clay says he doesn't really want to, but Tony ends up coming out and asking Clay if he needs a ride. Clay says no, so Tony says that they can just leave. That's where we get confused if Tony's actually helping or just being creepy. But it seems like Clay goes to the cafe as Hannah and Jessica talk for the last time. Apparently Alex ended up breaking up with her, and Hannah says she really doesn't know about it. But apparently rumors are going around that she done stuff with him, and that's where Jessica says that Hannah's just another slut. But Jessica says that the tapes are apparently just Hannah lying, which being like Clay, I know that Hannah didn't lie about these. And we see that Justin's been laying low out of school as he's just been playing Call of Duty. Tell him that Jessica's looking bad, and Justin says he already knows. While Tony comes in the cafe with Clay and talks to him. Ends up telling Clay he's the slowest yet and he needs to get to finishing those tapes. While Jessica finally finds Justin and asks where he's been and what he told the principal. But he ends up saying that everything's fine. And Jessica's also scared that Clay might tell about the tapes, but Justin says he won't. And then Jessica asks a good question: if Hannah wasn't lying, then why is Justin here? And we'll figure that out later. While Hannah's mom and dad end up thinking that she found something, one of her good friends a call, and it seems like it's Tony. There it seems like Clay ends up seeing him. Doesn't get how everyone's evolved. And we're back with tape 3. So we end up starting out with Jessica looking around for Justin, as it seems like his mom doesn't care, and neither does his stepdad. And that's where we figure out that Justin's been staying at Bryce's house, because growing up they were best friends. Now as Marcus trying to become one of Clay's friends, we hear Hannah's voice overlay as this tape is Alex's. Because yes, Alex started a relationship and didn't tell Hannah about it, but it seems like that's not the only thing bad he did. Clay ends up going up to Alex. Hannah's mom ends up passing the memoriam that they left for, as Courtney says that they really miss Hannah. But Hannah's mom ends up saying a real friend would have known that she didn't like roses. Ooh. But now at school, Clay ends up going up to Hannah awkwardly and asking her if she wants to watch the moon with him. Of course, Clay ends up freaking out, but she does say yeah. Justin ends up hearing knocking on the door and ends up figuring out that it's Jessica as she holds him. But next day in class, Clay's teacher ends up playing with his black and white shows and ends up falling asleep, so Clay ends up running out, where he actually ends up finding Alex, but it seems like the guidance counselor found them both. And just like he asked Justin questions, he ends up asking Alex. So the night of the moon that Clay wanted to show Hannah ends up popping up as they watch it above the theater. Clay almost ends up kissing Hannah, but he ends up hesitating, as if he would have done it, he probably would have changed how her life went. But next day in school, she's actually super happy since her and Clay watched the moon. But now it seems like a paper's going around everywhere. And of course the boy that started it was Alex. So Hannah ends up taking one of the papers to see who's on it, and she's on there for the nicest butt, which literally everyone has already seen. Clay ends up sitting with her at lunch, as she talks about she can't wait to get out of this school. She says she wants to go to New York City and do college there, as people won't know her like they do here. But while Clay and Tony are in the gym, Clay ends up asking why he was at Hannah's house, and he says it's because he helps the family here and there. And that's where Alex ends up coming up to Clay and tells him not to answer any of Mr. Porter's questions, because he's trying to dig deep on the suicide. Now back to the day that Alex ended up making that paper, Hannah's really pissed, but he ends up making it off like he ended up having sex with her, because apparently everybody on the team ends up thinking she's easy. Jessica ends up getting some groceries for Justin, while Mr. Porter, the guidance counselor, is now talking to Courtney and Marcus. Clay and Alex end up finally meeting up as they talk about the tapes, and that's where Clay asks if what he did on the tapes was true, and that's where Alex ends up asking did he really do that at Jessica's party, and Clay says what? And Alex asks if Clay's watched all the tapes. He says he's only on his tape, which Alex says he already watched all those tapes twice and one not. Next day after Alex ended up making that paper about Hannah, she goes to buy a piece of chocolate as Bryce says he'll pay for her, and he ends up sexually assaulting her and telling her that she has a nice butt and everyone was right. So she walks out as any girl would, broken. And now Clay's starting to figure out what she went through that he didn't notice. But Clay ends up going to the same store and ends up seeing Bryce. So Bryce makes him buy a beer, and they make him and Alex chug the beer to see who drinks it down faster. Clay ends up winning, as Tony ends up seeing him and telling Clay he shouldn't be hanging out with him. But Clay just argues as Tony's actually pissed and drives away. But Clay doesn't care where he's going as he follows him. But as soon as Clay gets to Tony's car, we see that Tony and some other dudes are beating the crap out of this dude. So while Alex, Justin, and all the others hang out, as Clay's starting the fourth tape, and Hannah says that if you made it this far, this one's going to be the most illegal thing yet. So pick up the map, look at where the location is, and get ready to roll. Because this time we're doing it in the middle of the night. And let's hope my boy Clay don't get caught. And we're back with tape 4. We start straight back as Clay's playing the tape, ready to leave his house, figuring out where Hannah's map's gonna lead him next. He finally ends up getting over to the house, but Marcus ends up pulling Clay over, asking what he's doing. Clay tries to play it off, but he ends up figuring out that Marcus knows about the tapes because he's on them too. But Marcus says he didn't even look at any of the tapes, says don't worry about it. And that's where we figure out that the person on the tape is Tyler. And the reason that the mirrors are shattered on his house is because Hannah told everybody on the tapes to do it. But now we gotta figure out how Tyler's involved. So one day Clay ended up walking Hannah back to her house after the theater. But as soon as he left her alone, she tried to walk in her house and ended up hearing a camera go off. At first, outside, she just thought it was a twig, but now she's starting to hear it inside as she undresses. And instead of Hannah doing anything, she just sits there frozen, not knowing what to do. All of the parents end up coming to the school as they're wanting to know if their kids are going through suicide. And that's where Hannah's mom comes in and tells everybody that they just need to watch their kids, because their kids are the reason that some kids want to commit suicide at this school. But back at school now, Alex, Bryce, and Zach are trying to get Clay to hang out with them. But Tony ends up talking to Clay, saying that he needs to watch out for Zach and them as they only want to use him. But as Clay's going home, we see that a bunch of kids end up TPing Hannah's mom's house. So Clay tries to do the right thing and take all of it down, but the mom comes out thinking that Clay did it. She ends up saying she's going to call the cops, but Clay ends up telling her that he was one of Hannah's actual friends, so she asks him inside. But after school, Hannah ended up asking Courtney if she wanted to come over, so they hang out and actually goes pretty well. She shows Hannah her flashlight, and as Clay is talking to Hannah's mom, she tries to go in depth, asking if she ever went through depression or suicide that he noticed, and he says no. Courtney says as they're drinking, they might as well play a drinking game, but Courtney ends up kissing Hannah, as it seems like Courtney's hiding a little bit of feelings from Hannah. But as Courtney's drunk, Hannah remembers hearing the sound of that camera as she tries to go look who it is, and she ends up finding out that it's Tyler. As he gets his stuff and runs away, my boy's zooming. But Courtney ends up freaking out, thinking that she's getting exposed, as she doesn't even talk to Hannah the next day. Which is actually the crazy part, because Courtney stopped talking to her because of these pictures, but apparently none of the school figured out that it was them. But Clay knows that it's Hannah and her now, so he gets the lotion and gets to it. But next day, when Clay ends up getting home from school, we see that Tony's already there because Clay's mom asked him over. Clay's mom ends up thinking that the recordings are still a project, and as Tony and Clay both go back and forth about the project, we both know what they're really talking about. And while Alex, Justin, and all of them are toking the bong, they talk about how Clay's going too far with the tapes. So Justin ends up telling them if he keeps going too far that they need to scare him. But randomly at Bryce's door, they end up seeing a box that looks like it's just the tapes. So they think it's the tapes, but they open it up to see it's not, because it's actually Bryce's dad's thing and he doesn't know about the tapes. So they end up acting it off like they were high, but everyone else seems to be on the tapes, which Clay's in for it because Justin's acting like a crackhead. But as it's nighttime and Hannah's voice overlays, Clay ends up actually going back to the house just to hit it with a rock. But Clay also gets another idea to get Tyler back, as Tyler's phone goes off and he sees a nasty picture, which it looks like Clay's done something really dirty, as Jessica, Alex, and everyone's getting the picture, and even Justin gets it, saying that they need to deal with Clay now. And as Tyler breaks down, next time we're gonna figure out what Clay actually sent to everybody. And we're back with tape 5. We start this episode off at the winter formal as Hannah talks about guys are horrible but girls can be worse, while it plays this beautiful love song as Clay stares over and sees Hannah. One of his friends end up telling him to go over and approach her, as Clay's definitely too scared, but he tells him just to do it because this is his one chance, which he actually does get up and dance with her, spending probably the happiest moment of his life, until she starts bleeding from her wrist and we figure out that it's actually a dream. Okay, now we're starting the episode off with Clay waking up. He ends up eating breakfast with his dad, as his dad asks if he ended up taking a shower, and he says that showers are honestly just a waste of time. Ew. As Clay goes to get a coffee to wake up, we figure out that Courtney is the next one on the tape. And let me tell you, this one's definitely gonna make you mad. So even though Courtney doesn't want anybody to know she's kind of lesbian, she does have 2 gay dads. Our last episode, I know I didn't talk about it, but apparently as Clay figured out what Tyler did, he ended up showing everybody a picture of Tyler's butt. That it seems like everyone's judging him for. And next day, Hannah tries to talk to Courtney, but she's still unstable from that picture going around. The guidance counselor ends up calling in Tyler because apparently 4 people ended up pantsing him, which kind of seems trash as he's in the office. But Hannah tries to sit with Courtney one more time at lunch, where Courtney ends up saying that those seats are taken. Hannah ends up saying that nobody knows about the picture, so they need to become friends again. But Courtney's friends end up coming over to sit with them, but Courtney ends up telling Hannah to stay as they end up talking about winter formal. So Hannah ends up buying her a dress and getting a free car as she ends up going out with her friends. And Hannah ends up even seeing Jessica there as they haven't talked. So Alex ends up coming up, and of course Hannah's okay with talking to him, but Hannah still isn't. But Justin ends up coming up to her, and I guess this is the first time they've met. So now we're back at the dance as Clay's looking over at Hannah. His friend ends up coming over and telling him that he needs to go dance with Hannah, as we see that his dream actually was real. So Clay asks if she wants to dance. And even though they can't dance to this song, it still seems like they have a good connection. But while Courtney's with her friends, this kid named Monty ends up trying to come up to her, as he says that she's definitely the one from the photos. But Courtney says that ain't true, as she wants to tell him a little secret about Hannah. But lucky for Clay, as he asked Hannah for a dance, it finally gets to a slow song. But of course, as soon as all goes good, we see that Jessica's definitely too drunk, so Hannah goes over to help. But as Hannah's trying to get Jessica, Monty comes over to Hannah, and that's where Monty says that Courtney told her some crazy stuff that she's done. So she asks what she said. And apparently Courtney told Monty that Hannah asked Courtney for a three-way. And also all that stuff that everyone said about Justin was true, which none of those rumors are true, as Hannah goes and storms off to Courtney. And that's where Hannah tells Courtney just because she's lesbian doesn't mean she can tell everybody that Hannah's doing things, which is another break of a friendship, which I'm gonna tell you right now, if I was Hannah, I would have beat the crap out this girl. But Clay ends up going up to Courtney as he heard the tape. He ends up asking if she can help him. So they end up getting in Courtney's car as Clay shows her a location to drive to, and she tells him she'll drive to it. And we figure out that Clay ends up taking Courtney over to Hannah's grave, just so Clay can tell Courtney how bad she really ruined Hannah's life, which Clay definitely cracks her as she finally starts to feel bad for what she's done. So she ends up getting up, leaving in her car, leaving Clay. While back after winter formal, Tony ended up giving Hannah that slow song, which we can definitely tell that Hannah likes Clay as she wants to keep this song as a memory. But Tony ended up following Clay as he knows that Courtney wasn't going to come back for him. So Tony ends up telling Clay that he needs to calm down a little bit, not taking Courtney out here and then posting pictures of Tyler's butt. And he asks Clay if he needs a ride home, but Clay ends up saying that he'll just take his bike. But of course he ends up getting stopped by Justin and the others. So they make him get in the car and tell Clay that he's not going to be talking to anyone or bullying anybody else on the tapes. As Alex starts to gas the car, Clay starts to get scared. He tells him to slow down, that he'll calm down. But Alex ends up going faster and faster as a cop ends up blue lighting them. And it actually seems like Justin and the others don't know that this is his dad, but this is Alex's dad. So he ends up just giving them a warning. And while Clay and Tony were actually talking, Tony actually gave Clay the song. But the more Clay gets into these tapes, we see how much it's actually stressing out his life. And we're back with tape 6. We start out at school as Alex almost gets hit by Monty and Justin. But apparently Alex ain't playing today, so he tells Monty to get out and let's fight. But we all knew this wasn't going to go good for Alex. And while all that's happening, we come back to Hannah and all the others out to Valentine's Day. While the guys counselor ended up finally breaking out the fight. And Sherry, which is Clay's only friend that seems to be chill, ends up making sure that he's okay and wants to hang out later. While back then, Sherry actually helped Hannah print out a poster for Valentine's Day. And how it works is basically both of them get each other's number, and Hannah got Marcus's number. He says that he doesn't want to be like part of the crew and he actually wants to take her out on a date. As Hannah's voice overlays and we figure out that Marcus is the next tape. But at work, Hannah ends up telling Clay about it, and we can see that Clay's jealous, but he's just happy that she's happy. While Alex is not looking too good. Hannah ends up going to the diner that Marcus picked and waiting 2 hours, while Clay and Sherry actually go out to a coffee shop and talk. But after that, they end up going over to Clay's house, which his mom is a little surprised about. But after all that time, Hannah ends up seeing Marcus pull up with all of his boys, but sits down alone and says that he's sorry that he took so long. Sherry ends up getting close to Clay and we see that they actually have a good connection. But that's when Sherry tells Clay not to watch her tape because she doesn't want Clay to think different of her. So Clay ends up thinking that she's just being nice so he won't watch the tape, so he tells her to please leave. while Marcus sits down to Hannah and gets real close and sexually assaults her. And it's sad to see that they all like this. He keeps messing around until Hannah pushes him off, and he just says that she's a tease and for them to come on, as Hannah just sits there traumatized. And while it hits not Tom, Tony ends up sitting in his car as he listens to Hannah's tapes at her grave. He's starting to figure out maybe everything really is true. And we're back with tape 7, also being the mid-season finale. Clay ends up starting the tape, and we get straight to it as Zach's the one for this tape. Last, basically, they could leave each other notes, and Hannah ended up getting left a note from Zach, which isn't bad, because Zach doesn't seem like a bad guy. And right after Marcus tried to sexually assault Hannah, Zach actually ended up coming back, paying for her milkshakes, and actually trying to be there for her. But even at the cafeteria later on, it seems like she still doesn't really want to talk to Zach, which all his friends end up thinking is funny since all of them try to get with her. So he ends up just storming off. Back with Clay, we see that Courtney's actually acting super nice to Clay now, and Marcus is just chilling. And they ask why Clay's here, because it's actually at a basketball game after school. And Clay ends up seeing Zach on the court since he's a basketball player, and goes straight over and Mike Tyson's him. But of course that's not what really happened. Clay ended up just freezing on the court, and Sherry tries to check up on him, but Clay just still doesn't care about it right now. Hannah ends up putting down another note, but she ends up looking for the note that Zach would leave her, and it ends up not being there. And Tyler ends up sitting down beside Clay as he takes pictures of the basketball team, asking Clay what's his next move. Since if you haven't seen, Tyler's actually an outcast and the others don't like him. The ball ends up coming over to Clay mid-game, and he ends up chucking it at Zach. And Clay ain't looking too well. Psych, he ends up freezing again. So Tyler throws it. What was that? Bryce ends up asking Jessica if she wants to come over later so they can all drink. And he says they can chill in the hot tub until Justin gets off, which seems like Justin doesn't understand. And this time Hannah ends up putting a really important note in for the class to hear anonymously, while Zach's getting buckets on the team like it's 2K. Clay ends up leaving, and he goes and keys Zach's new car. Sky ends up finding him, which she's just a friend that's at a coffee shop that actually talks to Clay all the time, and she just tells him to rock on. While Clay ends up waking up next day to see Zach's mom and Zach aren't too happy about his car. The teacher ends up reading the anonymous note that Hannah wrote as it's really suicidal and someone that really needs help. And she did it purposely because she knows that Zach would know it's her. But Sky ends up saying whoever wrote that is actually hurting, and Zach ends up making it off like it was Sky, but Hannah knows that Zach knows it's about her. Zach says to Clay that he's not really mad, and he tells Clay that he really does miss Hannah. Zach ends up getting the note that the teacher read out loud, as Hannah thought he lost it, but he actually kept it this whole time. While Clay ends up going over to Tony's house and says he's done with the tapes and gives them back. He starts acting nice to everyone, which is weird. And Clay's starting to act super suspicious, so the guidance counselor tells him that he needs to come now and tells everyone to go to class. As Clay ends up looking back at all of them, it seems like it's Clay versus them, and we'll figure out what happens next video.